If one takes on too much, one must be aware that there is a risk of not being able to cope with it because one's strength is not infinite. In such a situation, it is worthwhile to review one's own life and cut out the unnecessary. The most important thing is not to go to extremes, as in today's story. For the staff of the medical center in Springfield, Missouri, USA, June 2013 was very stressful. When 24-year-old Staudte was brought to the hospital, she was in a bad condition, lost consciousness, and screamed in pain when she came to. A brain hemorrhage and kidney failure were diagnosed. All her organs failed and then began to work chaotically again. The doctors could not understand what was happening to the young patient, who was literally fading before their eyes. The fight for Sarah's life lasted several days. Finally, the police were called when an anonymous tip came in. The person reported that the Staudte family had been suffering from strange illnesses for a year, which were costing them their lives. First, Sarah's father, named Mark, then her brother, named Shaun. Both died before they could receive medical help. Now it was Sarah's turn. She was much luckier because she came to a medical center, otherwise she would have died long ago. The police began to find out what mysterious illness the Staudte family was confronted with. The investigators believed that none of this was a coincidence. It was a large family of 6. Mark and Diane were parents to Shaun and 3 daughters, Sarah, Rachel, and Brian. Mark Staudte was born in 1961 in St. Louis and was the head of the family. He met his future wife in Texas when he was studying in college. The young people seemed to be opposites from the start, but soon found common ground and began dating. Mark was always positive, creative, and played in a band, while Diane seemed to be a somewhat more complex person, reserved and rather introverted. The relationship between the two developed quickly. Soon she became pregnant, whereupon they immediately decided to have a wedding. After Shaun's birth, Diane continued her studies, graduated from nursing school, and then worked in the cardiology department of the hospital. And Mark became a housewife and took care of the house and children. Apparently, the wife was more concerned with professional success and actively worked to provide the family with everything necessary. The young mother was looking for a better place with a high income. Several moves were even necessary until I finally settled the Staudte family in Springfield, Missouri. It is a quiet town, perfect for children and family life. It was also Diane's hometown, a rather conservative and religious place, but here she felt safest. In the following years of marriage, 3 girls were born. As it looked, they seemed to be a perfect family, but not everything went so smoothly. So Shaun suffered from health problems from a young age. During his school years, the young man was diagnosed with autism, which is why he required special conditions. Despite the efforts of the head of the family, the girls also had problems with learning at school. And this particularly affected Sarah. But even that was not the family's main problem. They simply did not have enough money for a fulfilling life. With the newcomers, one person could no longer provide for everyone else. In addition, they had to buy a new house as the old one was no longer big enough. Of course, Mark also occasionally participated in the family household when he had an occasional income. Sometimes he worked as a bartender, but above all, he dedicated his time to his children. In his free time, he was creative. He wrote music, songs, played several musical instruments. It is not surprising that he began performing with his music group. All of this brought some income, but it was still not enough for such a large family. Despite the problems, it seemed as if they were jointly ready to overcome all difficulties. At least, that's how it looked until April 8, 2012. The day after Mark's 61st birthday, the police were called to the house where the family lived. There they found the man's body, which was already cold. According to the wife, he died of an unknown flu-like illness that rapidly progressed and ended in a fatal seizure. Diane said that her husband had been suffering from an unknown illness for several days. She spent all her time with him to relieve his pain, but Mark's condition was getting worse. The circumstances seemed strange, and the body itself also looked unusual. Above all, the deceased's skin was noticeably yellower than that of a healthy person. Diane, Mark had a seizure on the day of his death. Although her husband had never suffered from anything like it, she believed it was related to his age. The wife said that she wanted to take Mark to the hospital immediately after the seizure, but he insisted that he wanted to stay home and recover. Nevertheless, the wife did not listen to him and started packing, but when she was finished, she found her husband without any signs of life. Minutes had passed since the seizure. She immediately notified emergency services. After a cursory examination, nothing suspicious could be determined. The death certificate stated that he had died of natural causes, with the deceased's age being mentioned. Shaun was very worried about his father during this time. He described on his social media page all the symptoms the man was suffering from and doubted the natural cause of death. Diane insisted that her husband's body should be cremated. Afterwards, his ashes were scattered over the local lake near the church. Mark's death was a real shock for everyone. He was strong, healthy, and active. It was strange that the man gave up so abruptly, however. This incident did not arouse as much suspicion as the next tragedy that befell the Staudte family. 5 months had passed when the police were called to another house on September 2, 2012, albeit for similar reasons. It was a large house, more suitable for such a family. Diane and her children lived there. She had acquired the new house by selling the old house and receiving the insurance payout for her husband's death. Diane reported that she found her 26-year-old son Shaun dead in his room on that fateful day. Here too, the situation was similar to the progressive flu that the young man's father had not survived. This time the mother, who had an unpleasant experience after the death of her spouse, had time to react and took her son to the doctor on the second day after the onset of symptoms. The doctor found nothing suspicious in him except for a water imbalance in his body. Afterwards, the boy's condition continued to worsen, but his mother did not take him to the doctor. In her opinion, he refused the doctor's help and felt unwell. The mother attributed this behavior to autism. On the night before his death, the boy began to feel better. She assumed that the unknown illness had receded and went to church with her daughters in the morning to pray for Shaun. Her son was sleeping, but when she came back, he showed no signs of life. Apparently, he had tried to get out of bed and had fallen, so he was lying on the floor. A pool of blood flowed from his mouth. For everyone, the death of such a young man was a shock. He himself worked in a center for people with disabilities, and everyone described him as very positive and friendly. Like Mark's body, Shaun was also cremated and his ashes were scattered over the lake. About 9 months passed before the next incident occurred to the family. In June 2013, the family's eldest daughter, Sarah, was hospitalized with similar symptoms to those her brother and father had died from. The police arrived at the hospital 2 days after Sarah had been admitted in critical condition. The doctors fought for her life but could not tell the police anything concrete. The medical professionals were still trying to find out the cause of the strange flu-like illness. It was strange, however, that her kidneys and brain failed. The medical professionals conducted numerous tests. They did not dare to say it out loud, but they already suspected then that Sarah had been poisoned. As the police found out, she was led to the medical center by an anonymous call from the church, the same church the Staudte family attended and where Diane had played the organ for many years. The pastor did not believe it was an accident and feared that the murderer would go unpunished, which is why he notified the police. The man described his suspicions. He believed that Mark's death and Sarah's critical condition might be connected. According to the driver, the first death, that of Mark, seemed strange to him. He was healthy until the last moment, and when a young man of years died under similar circumstances, the pastor seriously suspected Diane of being involved in these incidents. During this time, the woman told everyone that her daughter was just sick, while she behaved like a grieving widow and mother whose relatives died under unknown circumstances. As a result, she received the full support of the religious community. The pastor, however, believed that Diane deliberately used this mask to avoid questions on uncomfortable topics. The last time the woman visited her daughter in the hospital, she behaved quite differently. The nurses said she was in good spirits even when she first brought in the dying Sarah. She made jokes and generally spoke more about her daughter's health condition than about her upcoming trip to Florida. All of this happened despite the very alarming prognoses of the doctors. They were not sure if she would even survive this mysterious illness, and the mother didn't seem to care. All of this only strengthened the authorities' suspicion. However, since Diane had nothing to show, she was asked to come to the police station voluntarily to speak with the police. She agreed. On June 20, 2013, she reported to the police station. By this time, Sarah's condition had become somewhat more stable, but none of the tests conducted by the medical professionals showed any poisons in her body. It seemed as if they had been completely processed and left no traces. The investigators realized that they had to be very careful if they were likely dealing with a poisoner because the bodies of Shaun and Mark had been cremated. They were burned, which meant no tests could be performed on them. That made it very difficult to investigate their deaths. Therefore, the investigators hoped that Sarah would survive and help with the investigation. From their mother, they wanted to learn the circumstances of the victims' last days to get as many clues as possible about the reasons for the deterioration of their condition. The story Diane told was similar to Shaun's death. She had gone to church with her other daughters on that fateful day, and when she returned, she noticed that her eldest daughter was doing very badly. Previously, Sarah had suffered from similar symptoms to her brother and father for a few days, though in a milder form. That's why the woman didn't panic and didn't go to the doctors. She believed that they couldn't help anyway. When Diane came home and saw Sarah's condition, she finally sent her to the hospital. The first thing the woman wondered was whether her daughter wanted to take her own life voluntarily. Sarah suffered from bipolar disorder, so she might have done something to herself. The mother went through all the medications available to Sarah. She kept saying that her daughter no longer wanted to live. There had already been numerous similar incidents where Sarah had cut her wrists. It all sounded as if the woman was stubbornly trying to convince the police of her version of the story. Diane did not learn that in parallel, the deaths of Mark and Shaun were also being investigated because their deaths were now considered suspicious. The authorities did not want to scare off the potential perpetrator. Meanwhile, Sarah was in the hospital and the doctors were still looking for the poison. Meanwhile, Diane behaved quite strangely. As she answered questions, she began to reveal that Sarah was a very difficult child who couldn't find a job, had been learning poorly lately, and had high tuition fees to pay. Her revelations sounded like an excuse for certain behavior. All of this seemed strange because hardly anyone would think about such things when their daughter was dying in the hospital. Then the main suspect began to talk about her dislike for her husband, who hardly worked and spent all his free time on entertainment. The investigators just listened to the woman as she made one revelation after another. Diane confessed that she had always thought Sarah was disturbed because of her bipolar disorder. She continued to live with her family and never intended to move out. Her mother admitted that for a long time she had even hoped that she would take her own life. Now it seemed as if it had happened. Diane repeated several times that she would not harm her relatives. After some time, however, she was led to an unexpected confession. The widow told the investigators that her husband and children had drunk antifreeze. With that, everything was clear, because poisoning with this substance is indeed very dangerous and shows similar symptoms to a whole complex of chemical compounds, making it difficult to identify. It leads to a slow and agonizing death. The woman even admitted to having drunk antifreeze herself, as she had for some reason observed the family doing so. Of course, the investigators did not believe these absurd stories. The suspicion was quickly confirmed when they checked her browser history. As it turned out, she had begun searching for information on the signs and methods of poisoning long before her husband's death. Among other things, she was interested in antifreeze. She was obviously looking for the most effective and inconspicuous killing agents, considering various drugs, minerals, and essential oils that have an overwhelming effect on the body. The woman was not sparse with words, so several queries sounded very provocative. E.g., how do I kill my husband? How do people with bipolar disorder kill themselves? All of this indicated the planning of murders long before her husband's death. When Diane was asked about all this during a subsequent interrogation, she denied guilt. But after a lengthy interrogation, the suspect admitted that her husband's demise did not look as it was originally told. When Mark had a seizure, the woman made sure there were no more signs of life and then waited another 5 minutes to be certain he would not be saved. According to Diane's own statement, she did this because she hated her husband. Everyone described the man as a very good-natured and intelligent person. The hatred was probably triggered by the couple's handling of the family budget. Diane simply couldn't cope with the workload anymore, as she was the main breadwinner of the family, but couldn't wait for her spouse's help. She felt exactly the same hatred for her son Shaun. His mother couldn't look at him because she considered him the real problem of the family. Because of his difficulties, he only sought understanding and warmth from his mother, but instead she constantly threw him out of the room whenever her son came in. To make matters worse, Shaun began to harbor suspicions when he researched his father's illness. When Mark died, Diane realized that she could no longer tolerate her sick son, and she began pouring antifreeze into his drinks every day. It only took a few days for a lethal dose of the substance to be reached. At least that's what it sounded like from the woman's words, but that was a lie. The man had been agonizingly dying for over a week before he finally left this world. Now her attention and dissatisfaction turned to her eldest daughter. In the mother's eyes, Sarah became the main problem of the family. Sarah spent too much money on an education that, however, was doomed to failure due to her mediocrity. She dreamed of becoming a French translator, took out a student loan that had to be repaid soon after college graduation. But Sarah had no career prospects, and her mother refused to pay her debts. Diane hated Sarah for not being able to find a job and solve her financial problems herself. 4 days before she was hospitalized, her mother began mixing antifreeze into her food. At the police station, she confessed that she had sent her daughter to the hospital so quickly because she couldn't stand the situation and her suffering. Of course, the woman felt no pity. The story that she wanted to kill painlessly also turned out to be a delusion. In fact, she had prepared drinks in advance that consisted of almost half antifreeze. Diane had stocked up on cola bottles with which, according to experts, one could kill up to 30 people at once. All of this was stored in the refrigerator to systematically poison her family. This seemed particularly disturbing as her 2 other daughters were still in the house. Brianna, for example, who was just 12 years old. The mother, however, was not afraid that her youngest daughter might accidentally consume the drink. After all, she had already planned to kill her. Right after Sarah's death, they needed physical evidence to convict the woman. Despite the cremation of her husband's and son's bodies, some fragments of Mark and Shaun could be found during the autopsy. The investigators offered to examine these to determine if the deadly substance had left traces in the bodies of the 2. The tests revealed the presence of ethylene glycol, the main component of antifreezes. Before arresting the poisoner, the police decided to find out if she had an accomplice, as it was difficult to realize all of this alone. It is hard to imagine that the suspect managed to keep all the people close to her in the dark. The investigators told Diane nothing of their intentions and simply arrested her. And then another daughter of the woman was summoned for questioning, Rachel, the year-old. She was immediately informed that her mother had confessed to poisoning the family. Her reaction was striking. She was very nervous and obviously knew more than she said. The investigators simply wanted to speak with her to learn more about what was happening in the house. Even before Diane's confession, Rachel had behaved strangely. She laughed and made inappropriate jokes, even though it was about the death of her family members, but she never admitted anything. When suspicion arose, the police decided to check their suspicions and conducted several searches in the family's apartment. They found a diary, which proved to be a valuable source of information that revealed the full extent of the villainy. Strange was the entry in which Rachel concluded that her father and then her brother would soon die. She managed to calm herself down by thinking that she would have money and her father's car. Particularly disturbing was that the entry was made a few months before Mark's death. All of this clearly indicated that Rachel knew about her mother's terrifying plans and didn't even try to stop her or warn her relatives. Apparently, she resigned herself to the fact that her entire family was about to die. When Rachel was shown the diary, she had obviously not expected such a turn of events. Rachel quickly broke down. She confessed that she had been her mother's accomplice from the beginning. The complicity began when the daughter helped Diane search for methods and poison on the internet. They even discovered that a bittering agent had been added to commercially sold antifreeze to prevent accidental ingestion. It was not suitable for poisoning and was therefore bought online. When the woman implemented her insidious plan, she prepared poisoned food and drinks, which her daughter passed on to her father, her brother, and even her sister. According to her confession, they poisoned each family member up to 3 times a day. The idea with the antifreeze was suggested by Rachel. According to her, she had the best relationship with her mother out of all family members, and Rachel was always the favorite daughter. Like Diane, she didn't like the others and considered them a burden. So both decided to get rid of them and start a new life. The Staudte family was stunned when Rachel published the following message on her social media page a month after her brother's death. "I don't think I've seen my mother so relaxed in a long time." Both seemed satisfied with this development. She revealed that they had discussed each of the murders in detail, that Mark should be killed. They both agreed on that, but with Shaun, Rachel was not sure. She was of the opinion that her brother did not need to be killed but could simply be taken to a special hospital and remain there forever. Rachel even argued with her mother about her brother, as she didn't want him to die. Later, however, she agreed that it would be better to eliminate him. Of course, she referred to the fact that she was under Diane's power, but the mere fact that she argued with her raised doubts about her mother's total control. It seemed as if mother and daughter were equally involved in planning the poisoning of their loved ones. Rachel stated that Sarah's poisoning had been a surprise to her. She believed that the main reason was not even money or her debts, but merely a trivial argument. Sarah and her mother constantly argued. Diane found her very annoying. As for 12-year-old Brianna, Rachel's comments about her were vague. From her words, it emerged that the teenager was also perceived as a burden, which is why the youngest family member was to be eliminated. Finally, Diane learned of her daughter's confession and offered to tell the whole truth to be credible, as there was no longer any point in lying. She agreed. According to the widow, her hatred for her husband began because she did not feel attracted to him. Furthermore, she was annoyed by his extravagance and his complete inability to keep the family afloat. The woman accused him of physical and verbal abuse and domestic violence. However, these statements were not confirmed by any person familiar with the deceased. In an attempt to deflect blame from herself, she added that her husband was also a con artist. But here too, no one from Mark's closest circle, including his band whom he saw almost daily, confirmed these statements. Even in Rachel's diary, it was written that her father was an exemplary family man and would rather hurt himself than anyone else. Although Rachel and Diane repeatedly stated feelings of bitterness, the investigators believed that the motive for the murders was rather trivial. Specifically, life insurance policies were taken out on each family member. With the payout after her husband's death, the widow was able to buy a new, larger house, and that was just the beginning of her insidious plan. Life insurance policies were also taken out for Shaun and Sarah, from which Diane intended to profit. Rachel's diary provided insight into her worries about the events. All of this was investigated to be used at the hearing. Finally, Diane admitted why it had been decided to take Sarah to the hospital, unlike the other 2 victims. As it turned out, Rachel simply didn't want someone else to die in their new home again. That is, they were not concerned about Sarah's death. They simply saw a dying loved one as a burden like all the others. Rachel justified this behavior with genuine distress. She recounted that she had numerous experiences related to her dead brother. One image stuck in her mind. He lay on the floor in a pool of blood near his mouth with cold, pale hands and glassy eyes. Afterwards, she moved into his room and repeatedly wrote in her diary that she was very disturbed during that time. She had nightmares in which Shaun appeared. Rachel and Diane were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. They were not released on bail. The Lutheran church that the Staudte family attended drafted an appeal on behalf of the entire congregation with words of support during this difficult time. Although the pastor himself went to the police and expressed his suspicions, he was the one who initiated the letter. He prayed for their souls. Rachel pleaded guilty and agreed to testify against her mother. She took responsibility for 2 counts of second-degree murder, as well as attempted second-degree murder. For these charges, she received a total of 2 life sentences, with the possibility of parole after 42 years. This means she can be released in 2055 when she will be 64 years old. During the sentencing, she apologized to her sister Sarah, who survived the poisoning. She learned to walk and speak again and underwent a long rehabilitation phase. Rachel then requested the conversion of her sentence and demanded a retrial, as she was afraid of the male lawyer. She claimed she had been intimidated by him and that he had forced her into these confessions. Furthermore, no psychiatric assessment was presented to her. Rachel began to claim that she had some kind of psychological problems. This appeal was eventually rejected, whereupon she made no further attempts to seek leniency. Diane Staudte was found guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. She used vague formulations until the very end and refused to fully confess her guilt. The woman was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. In one of her last interviews, Diane insisted that she had nothing to do with her husband's death and claimed that his addiction to alcohol and illegal substances was to blame. The man had gotten involved with dangerous people and suffered from it. At that point, the woman was so fed up with her husband and hated him so much that she didn't even want to help him. When Mark passed away, she was relieved. No evidence of Mark's addiction was ever found. This new version of Diane's story contradicted the diary entries and Rachel's statement, so no one believed her. Sarah's life would never be the same again. She never fully recovered from the severe poisoning, lives in a special center, and has a guardian. She dreams of her dead father and brother and believes that they watch over her like guardian angels. Sarah has forgiven her mother and sister and is not angry with them due to her faith. She is very religious and spends a lot of time in church. She hopes to fulfill her dreams of becoming a French translator and visiting Paris. Thanks for watching and take care.